Nobody knew her name 2 years ago. And the ones who did? They told her she wasn't ready. They said she was too young, too raw, too far outside the top 100 to even dream about a Grand Slam main draw. So here's what I need you to ask yourself right now. What happens when the girl everyone doubted walks into Rome, beats a top 31 seed, pushes the world number 2 to the absolute edge, and then receives a phone call that no one in that locker room saw coming? What happens when the very organization that sets the rules decides to rewrite them for her? Because that's exactly what just happened. And if you think this is just a story about tennis, you haven't been paying attention. Let's go back to May 12, 2026. Rome, Italy. The Foro Italico. One of the most iconic tennis venues on the planet. Red clay baking under the Italian sun. The ancient stadium walls holding decades of legends inside them. Federer has played here. Nadal has owned this clay. Serena Williams has walked these courts. And on this particular May evening, something was happening that would have seemed impossible to most people watching professional tennis just 18 months ago. The Philippine flags, blue and red and gold, had turned the Foro Italico into something that looked less like a Roman tennis tournament and more like a homecoming. Thousands of Filipino fans, voices raw, hands trembling, watching a 20-year-old girl from Manila hold her own on one of the most storied stages in world sport. But the tournament was over now. The flags were being folded. The crowd was thinning. The OFW fans who had flown in from London, Frankfurt, Amsterdam, and Madrid were pulling suitcases through cobblestone streets, already replaying every point on their phones. The tournament was done. Their girl had fought. Their girl had fallen in the third round. And now it was time to go home. Or at least, that's what everyone thought. Then the phone rang. And here's the thing about that phone call. Nobody in that room was expecting it. Not her team. Not her coach. Not the people who had watched Alex Eala grind through qualifying circuits and minor events and late-night practice sessions for years. The caller was from WTA headquarters in St. Petersburg, Florida. When they said what they said, the room didn't explode with noise. It went completely silent. Because there are moments so large, so unexpected, so beyond the scope of what you had planned for that afternoon, that your brain simply doesn't know whether to celebrate or fall apart. This was one of those moments. Alex Eala, a 20-year-old Filipina ranked number 38 in the world, had just been awarded a wild card entry into the main draw of the 2026 US Open. Not a qualifying wild card. Not a smaller tune-up event. Not a 250 in a city that nobody watches. The US Open. The final Grand Slam of the year. The hardest, loudest, most electric major in tennis. Played on the surface she was born to destroy. Now before I tell you what this actually means, and I promise you by the time we're done, you'll understand why this is one of the most significant moments in Philippine sports history, I need you to understand something about the WTA and how it works. The WTA does not hand out US Open main draw wildcards to players ranked number 38. That's not how this works. That has never been how this works. Typically, wild cards go to former champions making comebacks from injury. They go to local American favorites, players who drive ticket sales in New York. They go to marketable names whose presence adds value to the broadcast. They are, in short, political decisions dressed up as sporting ones. So when an organization with decades of tradition quietly bends its own unspoken rules for a 20-year-old from a nation that has never produced a Grand Slam singles champion, you have to stop and ask, what did they see? What happened in Rome that was so undeniable, so impossible to look away from, that the WTA decided this girl deserved a phone call that most players never receive in their entire careers? Because this decision didn't come from a boardroom calculation alone. It came from something she did on that clay. Something that made journalists stop typing, made coaches lean forward in their chairs, made security staff forget to check credentials because they were too busy watching the point being played. Let me walk you through what actually happened at the Italian Open. Because the statistics alone don't tell the story. They never do with her. When Alex Eala stepped onto the clay at the Foro Italico for her first match, she was ranked number 42 in the world and seeded accordingly, which is to say, she was not seeded at all. She was a name on a draw sheet, one of dozens, in a tournament built around the top 10. Her first big test came against Wang Xinyu, the 31st seed. A dangerous player. A clay court specialist who had already scalped higher-ranked opponents this season. Someone who knew exactly what she was doing on that surface, who had been playing professional tennis for years, who had no reason to take the Filipino teenager lightly. And what did Eala do? She dismantled her. Straight sets. Clinical. Efficient. But also, and this is the part that the stats will never capture, brilliant in moments that felt unrepeatable. There were points in that match where the stadium, which had been politely applauding like tennis audiences do, suddenly shifted. People put their phones down. Conversations stopped. Because the player on the far end of the court was not playing like someone who wasn't supposed to be there. She was playing like someone who had been waiting for this stage her entire life. And the Filipino supporters in the stands? They weren't just cheering. They were crying. Grown men in matching shirts, women holding flags above their heads with shaking arms, children who had been brought to this tournament by parents who wanted them to see something they might not understand for years, but would never forget. These weren't tears of relief. These were tears from people who had believed in something long before the world believed in it. Who had followed every ranking update, every match result, every Instagram post from tournaments that nobody else was watching. Post from tournaments that nobody else was watching. Who had said her name in conversations where the other person had to Google who they were talking about. And now here she was, on the clay of Rome, making those conversations look prophetic. But then came the third round. And this is where the story turns into something else entirely. Her opponent was Elena Rybakina. World number 2. Former Wimbledon champion. One of the most physically dominant servers in the history of women's tennis. A player whose serve has been clocked at speeds that make professional coaches genuinely uncomfortable. A player who makes top 10 opponents look ordinary. A player who had, just days before, been dismantling the field at the Italian Open with the kind of calm, methodical brutality that is the hallmark of someone who doesn't just want to win, she expects to. On paper, this matchup had no business being competitive. Rybakina was the class of the field. Eala was a 20-year-old who had never been past the third round of a premier event. You could have told any tennis analyst in the world that Eala would lose this match in under an hour and they would have nodded and said, "Sounds right." Instead, they got 1 hour and 32 minutes. 6-4, 6-3. Rybakina won. That's on the record. But what's also on the record, what anyone who watched those sets will tell you, is that this was not a routine third round. Eala did not capitulate. She did not disappear under the pressure of playing the world number 2 at one of the sport's cathedral courts. She constructed points. She moved Rybakina side to side on red clay, which, understand, is precisely the surface that was supposed to expose every limitation in the Filipinas game. There were service games where Eala held from deuce, and the crowd, a crowd full of European fans who had come to see Rybakina, who had paid for those seats specifically to watch the Kazakh champion perform, erupted anyway. For the girl on the other side of the net. That's the moment you know something is different. That's the moment you understand that what you're watching isn't just a tennis match. When the crowd that's rooting against you starts rooting for you, because they can't help it, that's when you know you're dealing with something special. And the WTA saw all of it. Not just through the scoresheet. Not just through the ranking points that moved Eala from number 42 to number 38 in one tournament. They saw what was happening in the stands. They saw the images that were flooding social media. Thousands of Filipino fans in that ancient stadium, flags raised toward the Roman evening sky, voices breaking on the syllables of her name. They saw what happens when a diaspora, scattered across continents, separated by oceans and visas and decades, finds a focal point for everything they've been carrying. The WTA has been in this business long enough to know what a draw looks like. And they had just watched one materialize in front of them on clay, at a premier event, in one of the most watched weeks of the tennis calendar. So they made the call. And now Alex Eala is going to the US Open. Let me explain what the wild card actually gives her, and why this changes the entire architecture of her 2026 season. Because I want to be precise here, because precision matters. At number 38 in the world, Eala technically already has a direct entry into most Grand Slam main draws, including the US Open. So the wild card isn't about access. What the wild card is about, and this is the part that most coverage has completely missed, is what it signals. It is the W putting a stamp on her story that says, "We believe in you publicly, loudly, and officially." It says that the organization which governs the entire sport has looked at her trajectory, looked at her results, looked at her Rome performance, and decided that she is worth honoring in a way that most players ranked 38 never get to experience. That is not a logistical advantage. That is a declaration. And declarations from the governing body of your sport have a way of echoing through locker rooms, through sponsors' offices, through broadcast negotiations, through conversations you will never hear about but which will shape the rest of your career. And then there's the practical reality of arriving at a Grand Slam without the weight of qualifying in your legs. Players who have had to fight through 3 rounds of qualifying against hungry, dangerous opponents who have nothing to lose arrive at the main draw already tired, already tested, already carrying the micro-injuries and the mental fatigue of 3 high-stakes matches before the tournament has even officially started. Some of the most stunning first-round Grand Slam upsets in history have happened because a top 30 seed was fresh and prepared while their qualifier opponent had been fighting for their life all week. Eala sidesteps all of that. She arrives in Flushing Meadows with a full week of preparation, rest, and practice behind her. She arrives fresh. She arrives ready. She arrives with the luxury of studying her opponent before the match instead of recovering from the last one. In a sport where the margins are measured in millimeters and milliseconds, that week of rest is not a small thing. It is enormous. Now I want to step back from the tactical and talk about something that I think is more important. Because what Alex Eala has done over the past 14 months is one of the most remarkable climbs in the recent history of women's tennis. And it hasn't received the attention it deserves outside of the Philippines and a handful of tennis-specific media. 14 months ago, she was ranked 140 in the world. Let me put that number in perspective. At 140, you are playing on courts that don't have ball kids. You are staying in hotels where the Wi-Fi password is written on a laminated card at the front desk. You are on long connecting flights, sharing practice courts, navigating a circuit where every week is a fight just to stay in contention for ranking points that most people will never count. From 140 to 38 in 14 months. That is not a progression. That is a sprint. And it was built on wins, not gifted ones, not lucky ones, not wins against opponents in bad form. Wins over top 10 players. Wins on multiple surfaces. A stunning semifinal run at the Miami Open in 2025 that announced her to the wider world. A quarterfinal appearance in Dubai. Results that forced the algorithm to keep moving her name up the list whether the broader tennis world was paying attention or not. And she's done it while carrying something that most players her age don't carry. She's carrying a country. Not in a metaphorical, inspirational poster way. In a real, weight of expectation way. Every time Alex Eala walks onto a tennis court, there are people watching in Manila who have set their alarms for 2, 3, 4 in the morning. There are Filipino workers in hospitals in London and construction sites in Dubai who are checking score updates between shifts. There are parents who named their daughters Alex because of her. There are kids picking up tennis rackets in the Philippines for the first time because of what they've seen her do. That is not pressure that most 20-year-olds are equipped to handle. The ones who buckle under it quietly disappear from the tour within a couple of years, talented players who couldn't separate their identity from their results. The ones who convert it into fuel, who use the weight of expectation as a reason to fight harder rather than a reason to contract, are different. Eala is different. You can see it in the way she plays when she's down. When she's broken. When she's facing a match point. That's when she becomes more herself, not less. Let me give you a specific example. Her third-round match against Rybakina in Rome, 64-63. She was broken early in both sets. She fell behind. The scoreboard at various points was not kind to her. And she kept playing. Not stubbornly, not recklessly, she kept playing smart, structured, purposeful tennis against a player who was hitting the ball harder than almost anyone else in the world. That composure is not something you find in a player who is playing for themselves alone. That composure belongs to someone who has decided that the people watching, the ones who set their alarms, the ones who folded those flags in Rome, deserve her best even when her best isn't enough to win. That's who she is. And the WTA recognized it. So what happens next? Because the US Open is the headline, but the summer before it is what will determine who Eala is when she walks through the gates at Flushing Meadows. The schedule is already set. Before New York, she heads to the grass court season, and her name is already on the Birmingham Open entry list. Birmingham is one of the most respected grass court events in the lead up to Wimbledon. Fast courts, low bounces, short points, a completely different athletic demand than the clay she just excelled on. Grass has a way of humbling clay specialists. The slide that makes you look elegant on red dirt becomes a liability on slick English lawn. The ball skids through the strike zone differently. The margins on serve and return shrink dramatically. It is a transition that takes time, and many players on the tour have never truly mastered it. But Eala is not most players. What separates her, beyond the shot making, beyond the footwork, beyond the tactical intelligence that coaches have been pointing to for years, is her adaptability. She has never been a one-surface player. Her results span clay, hard courts, and now she's preparing to add grass to the list of surfaces where she can be dangerous. The coaches who work with her have spoken about her ability to process tactical information quickly, to watch a match, identify a pattern, and implement a counter within the same session. That's rare. That's the kind of cognitive agility that you can't teach and can't manufacture. Either a player has it or they don't. Eala has it, which means Birmingham, rather than being a surface she survives, could be a tournament she uses. After Birmingham comes Wimbledon, her second Grand Slam of the 2026 calendar year, following a first-round exit at the Australian Open in January that stung but also instructed. Every Grand Slam is a lesson. Wimbledon will be another one. The lawns of the All England Club are the most mythologized courts in the sport, and for good reason. There is a specific kind of pressure that only Wimbledon generates. Something in the silence of the crowd during points, something in the white dress code, something in the way history sits on every match played there. To compete at Wimbledon is to be measured against a century of the game's greatest moments. Eala will walk in with more experience than she had in January. She will walk in with Rome behind her. And she will walk in knowing that whatever happens on those lawns, Flushing Meadows is waiting. And Flushing Meadows in August, the US Open, is where this entire story converges. Hard courts. Her surface. The court where she recorded her biggest career wins. The tournament where, 2 years ago, she was a name almost no one outside the Philippines had heard. And now she walks in with a WTA wild card, a top 40 ranking, a summer of elite competition behind her, and a fan base that is about to do something remarkable to the atmosphere at one of the biggest sporting events in the world. Here is something that most sports coverage never adequately captures. The Filipino diaspora in the United States is not small. It is not quiet. And it is absolutely, completely, devotedly locked in on Alex Eala. There are more than 4 million people of Filipino descent living in the United States, concentrated, significantly, in the New York metropolitan area. When she plays at Flushing Meadows, they will come. Not in the polite, scattered way that you sometimes see with international players who have a following in their home country. They will come in matching shirts and flags and groups of 20 and 30 and 50. They will fill sections of the Louis Armstrong Stadium with noise that shakes the broadcast audio. They will chant her name in Tagalog, in English, in a mix of both. They will cry on camera. They will be shown on the Jumbotron. They will become part of the story that the US Open tells itself. Because the US Open loves a moment, loves a crowd, loves the kind of electricity that only happens when a player means something to people beyond the game. And Eala will play in that atmosphere. She has played in it before, in Melbourne, in Dubai, in Rome, and every single time, rather than retreating from it, she has risen to it. She feeds on it. Not in the way that collapses under the weight of expectation, but in the way that converts expectation into focus, into aggression, into the kind of tennis that makes crowds scream on points they didn't even understand they were watching until they were already standing. There is one more thing I want to say before we wrap this up. Because I've talked about rankings and wild cards and surface transitions and diaspora crowds, And all of that is real, and all of that matters. But underneath all of it is a simpler story. A girl from the Philippines who loved tennis enough to leave home at a young age and train on the other side of the world. Who sat through losses that would have convinced most people to reconsider. Who climbed from 140 to 38 in a sport where the top 100 is already considered extraordinary. Who walked into Rome as a non-seed and walked out with the respect of the entire tennis world. Who received a phone call from the governing body of her sport and made the room go silent, not from shock, but from the weight of a dream that had finally, undeniably arrived. The WTA didn't give Alex Eala anything she hadn't earned. They recognized what was already there. And when she walks onto that hard court in Flushing Meadows in late August, under the New York sky, with the Philippine flags already raised and the crowd already on their feet before the first point is played, she will not be walking in as a wild card. She will be walking in as exactly what she has always been. A fighter. A phenomenon. A 20-year-old who has turned doubters into witnesses, and who is, by every measure that matters, only just getting started. The question isn't whether Alex Eala belongs on the biggest stages in women's tennis. Rome answered that. The question, the one that nobody knows the answer to yet, the one that will define how this story is remembered, is how far she goes once she gets there. And I don't know about you, but I cannot wait to find out.